The New Scramble, the so-called New Scramble, refers to the fact that over the past 10 to 15 years, probably, there's been a lot of new investors coming in Africa. So there's a big diversification of in terms of the number of possible investors in Africa, and also the kind of investors. Until the late 1990s, Africa was usually depicted as a continent that was so-called hopeless. There's even a famous cover of The Economist in May 2000 that had this as a title, Africa, the Hopeless Continent. And the situation changed quite dramatically in the course of the 2000s with the fact that many African countries became or had very important growth rates. GDP growth rates were among the fastest in many African countries. And also the arrival of a number of new investors in Africa changed completely the scene. And Africa was more and more seen across during the 2000s as a sort of new frontier of global capitalism instead of this place of hopelessness and despair. So you have a number of new countries, China in the first place, other BRICS countries, Brazil was very important, also a very important investor, but also Turkey, Morocco. Morocco is a hugely important investor in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, or has been for the past 20 years. So the New Scramble refers to that situation where you have a renewed interest for investment in Africa's riches, and as we know, Africa's riches is mainly based on its natural resources. It's very difficult to describe it in just a few words, but it's very important to see that China is not one single actor in Africa. China is of course a huge country, but also what so-called Chinese investments in Africa are extremely diverse. And in the early 2000s, much of Chinese investments, especially in remote places in Africa, were done by Chinese businessmen and women that did not necessarily come from China, but they might come from the Chinese diaspora. They might even come from other Asian countries, but be considered as Chinese in Africa. They might come from Cambodia, from Vietnam, etc., etc. There's a big diversity of actors in China itself. What's also interesting is to see that the history of Chinese investment in Africa also relates to the history of the opening up of Chinese economy within China itself. So when there was this new push for investing in Africa in the 1990s, some provinces within China that had been marginalized so far also used this opportunity and the credit support that was given by the state bank, the Exim Bank, to sort of raise their own economy within China, within their own provinces, to solve some of the problems they had in terms of unemployment, etc., etc. So what I'm saying here is that there's usually an image that China in Africa is like a huge army that is sort of conquering Africa before conquering the rest of the world, under the leadership of its general, which is the president of the Communist Party. That's maybe one part of story, of course, but the story is much more complex than that, and there's a lot of diversity in the Chinese presence and also in the way in which this Chinese presence was organized in the first place. So yeah, diversity, complexity, but then of course China has become a very important trading partner. It's also now growingly a very important partner to many African countries in security, including also in terms of buying weapons, etc., etc. So what I'm saying about the diversification is not to say that China is not an important actor. It's a very important actor, but it's very diverse. And the other part of the story that is also very important to tell is that African states, African countries have not been sort of passive onlookers when China and other countries started to invest massively in the 2000s. They are part of this story, and they're very much proactive actors in first drawing investors towards Africa, and also finding their own room for maneuver in this new context where it is possible, again in the 2000s, to invest in, for instance, big infrastructure projects which had been put in a drawer somewhere during the years of the structural adjustment programs, and which were again possible thanks to the availability of new funds through China, through Morocco, through Turkey, through Brazil, Indonesia, and India and other investors. So it's crucially important to look not just at the diversity of those investors, but also to consider the way in which African states and African leaders and African governments have been proactive in this relationship. There's a very interesting blog and website that is run by a very good South African journalist, Sean Jacobs, and a lot of people around him, which is called Africa is a Country. And of course, it's very ironic because they themselves are very critical of this idea. But it's, there's a general idea that Africa is all the same. It's just one big continent that nobody really understands. And on the contrary, as you say, there's a huge diversity in everything. In fact, there's a big historical diversity. There's a huge cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, also economic diversity. So on the one hand, it's hugely important to look at what we as researchers call the historicity of different African societies, and to consider that the history of South Africa is completely different from the history of Ethiopia, of the Central African Republic, of Senegal, and each have their own history, which seem very basic, but sometimes it's something that is quickly overlooked. So it's hugely important to look at those different historical dynamics, and there's to recognize this diversity. On the other hand, one of the big challenges for African countries is African unity, and is the ability of Africa to speak with one voice, to make itself heard, to be more present in the international scene. And it's one of the things that is driving now the African Union to try and be more united. The new free trade zone that was that started last year is a step in that direction to sort of. It's not really a Pan-Africanist project as would have been in the 1960s with Kwame Nkrumah, but it's the idea to bring down the barriers within Africa itself in order for Africa to be a stronger partner in global economics and politics. But so, yeah, it's the two things. Yes, Africa, the challenge is for Africa to speak in a more sort of united voice, but on the other hand, especially as outside observers, but also within Africa itself, it's crucially important to insist on the diversity and the differences in historical experience that the different countries have had.